Hey, everybody. Welcome to the Climbing Sycamores podcast, where we look at today's topics to get a better view of Christianity. I'm Annie Beege, and I'm joined by my friends Ben Sadler and Matt Harbach.
And we're rolling.
All right. Once again, we are down to two.
Yep.
We miss Annie, but she's got some stuff going on, and hope everything goes well, and we'll see her back next week.
You don't realize how hard it is to coordinate three people who work in the same very small building.
Right. Yeah.
It's
Life's
obscene.
getting busier and busier. You're an important professor now, and
Indeed.
I'm doing school, and Annie's continue expanding our reach when it comes to music, and so there's a lot going on. So, well, it's hard not to. I don't watch the news. I do everything I can to avoid the news because usually I feel like anytime I turn on the news, it's just propaganda trying to get me excited about something I don't want to get excited about or angry about something I don't be angry about. But there was a terrorist attack, and you can't avoid it, 2 Saturdays ago. And very sad, 1,500 Israeli humans, people, babies, women, elderly, murdered. And, it reminds us of the terrorist attacks that took place 9/11 on our soil. And since then, everybody's got an opinion, everybody's got an idea, and there's a lot of confusion. So I thought maybe we could read, I think there is a pretty good article on Christianity Today by Russell Moore. I think it's a good time for us to maybe remind ourselves what are our biblical values, not what are our just governing values of our country, or what are values of our, whatever political party you subscribe to, but what does it say biblically, and what do we look at biblically? But first, this article, Russell Moore, he makes the point, it's Christianity Today, Americans should stand with Israel. And I thought he made some really interesting points here. I don't know how much you're aware of like different theological groups, but there's an evangelical group of Christianity that has some very strange like end times prophecies, and they're called dispensationalists, where different groups of people have had different dispensations of grace. So they believe that you don't necessarily need to convert Jews to Christianity because they had the dispensation in the Old Testament of grace for just being Jews. And then they've kind of put together these different prophecies as they kind of use the Bible almost like like a hidden mystery novel that you're supposed to find some mystery code in like and figure out like end times.
Is flat.
Yeah, that kind of stuff. But so
Is Russell Moore a dispensationalist?
No, he's not a dispensationalist, and he makes that point. So some Christians are really siding with Israel based on some beliefs on some end times prophecies. Russell Moore is not one of them. I'm not one of them. But I thought he had some, he begins the article by recounting what happened a couple weeks ago on October 7th, and the brutal murders by Hamas. But then he says, some might assume that evangelical Protestants automatically support Israel based on the eschatological views that cast the modern state of Israel in some role in biblical prophecy. For some, this is indeed the case. Many of us, though, don't share those beliefs. We believe the promise of God are fulfilled in Christ, not in the 1948 Israeli Declaration of Independence. Many of us are quite willing to call out Israel when we believe it is acting wrongly. We don't believe that Israeli Knesset is somehow infallible. So inerrant and infallible. So what he's basically saying there is the reason he titles this article "Americans Should Stand with Israel" is not because of some necessary biblical prophecy that he thinks is going to come true, and it's not because of some idea that we have some necessarily biblical reason to do all this. So I think that's really important. But then as he goes on the second to last paragraph, he says this: as Americans, we should stand with Israel under attack because of it. It is a fellow liberal democracy, and a democracy that is in a region dominated by illiberal authoritarian regimes. As Christians, we should pay special attention to violence directed toward Israel, just as we would pay special attention to a violent act on a member of our extended family. After all, we are grafted into the promise made to Abraham, Romans 11:17. Our Lord Jesus was and is a Jewish man from Galilee. Rage against the Jewish people is rage against him, and because we are in him, against us. No one want to wake up to war in what was already a tinderbox of world order, but war has come, and we should recognize terrorism for what it is. We should also recognize the justice of a forceful response to that terrorism. However we read the prophecy passages of the Bible, and however we disagree on world politics, American Christians ought to stand together with Israel now. So it's a pretty straightforward article. I was texting back and forth with some classmates, and one of them was making some different points on how we have to kind of be careful on how we're supporting Israel and, look at things from both sides. And my response to him was, I don't care who does it, whether this was Israel doing the act, whether it was Hamas or the Taliban or whatever. Whenever somebody goes into a region and rapes women, murders children, and harms civilians to create terror and fear, that's wrong. And we just have to have the moral clarity to say that's wrong. So, and that's kind of what his article is saying. It's not because of some special prophecy that, or we have some blind faith in Israel that we have to stand beside them. But when terrorism happens, you have to just call it out. What do you think?
Yeah, well, so there's kind of like two things that I thought the issue was different, actually, because there's two factors here, and one is that I think you can side with Israel, but because of the nature of like a terrorist attack, they're not a sovereign country necessarily. Mm-hmm. So then, in order for Israel to retaliate, there will probably be loss of civilian life, which there has been. Mm-hmm. And so on one level, I thought it was kind of like, well, Israel shouldn't just go into the Gaza Strip because they might take out a lot of civilians. I can kind of see that angle of it. I don't understand the whole like being pro Hamas though.
Right.
I don't understand it at all.
There's a lot of different ideologies that are behind it. Why some groups are pro Hamas in the States. I do think, and we were talking a little bit before the podcast, I think if people would really read up on the origins of critical race theory, and that's talked about coming out of postmodernism in colleges, it would make more sense why there's more sympathizers of Hamas in the United States. I think there's a different reason why Palestinian people are pro-Hamas. Some are pro-Hamas in other parts of the world, and it's not. I don't have enough. I've done enough research over the years, but not enough to be an expert on it. I just believe that we need moral clarity, that anytime you have an ideology that sets itself up and says this group of people needs to go,
yeah,
and we are justified in doing whatever we want to that group of people. And you see this, I think it is just diabolical. You see the same kind of ideology in the Ku Klux Klan. We can get rid of anybody who's black because all black people are bad. That's what the Ku Klux Klan would say. Mm-hmm. the Nazis, anyone who is Jewish, we have to get rid of. Hamas, that's basically their charter, is to get rid of any Jewish person. Any ideology that sets itself up to get rid of a group of people and can justify that is not biblical.
Yeah, I would agree with that.
I don't know. That seems controversial today, but that is the idea of this critical race theory, is this idea that there are privileged groups that need to be dethroned, and we are justified in doing whatever we can to these different groups. In some ways, they're right that there has been oppression and evil across lots of groups. But then you need to go after the oppression and stop what's going on and go after those specific people and problems and stop that, whatever that means. But then to clump anyone who looks like that group or associates has a cultural association with these different groups that they all deserve to be wiped out, that's the evil part of it. And I think that's what we're seeing all over our country, and that's kind of the core idea. But the Bible really says we are one race. We all came from two people. Yeah. We have different levels of melanin in our skin. We have different levels of, we have different cultures and backgrounds and things like that, but we came from two people. And humans were all made in the image of God. And God says in Genesis chapter 9, because humans were made in the image of God, whoever sheds the blood of a human by human, their blood will be shed. So there is a special protection that we are to give to all human life. Mm-hmm. And then those who have harmed human life need to be brought to justice. That's how the Bible would describe it.
Yeah, I don't think you're saying anything controversial.
But it seems controversial right now, I think.
I know.
I guess the reason I wanted to talk about this was just to lay out again biblical principles, because I think there are quite a few people who are confused on what it means to be a Christian, and you take a little bit from each one. It sounds Christian to respond to oppression. That's true. If you're an oppressed people, we need to respond to that. Mm-hmm. But how do you respond if you're being oppressed? You stop the oppressors, those specific people, and you bring them to justice. You don't clump them in with now every person in that group now has to be eradicated from the earth.
I don't think people around here know how they like that. I think just the gall of anyone living in this country to side with a terrorist group as though you two are being oppressed at the level that the terrorist group is oppressing anybody in Israel.
Right. Yeah.
I mean, who is oppressing you in this country so badly that you are fearing for your life? I mean, that's nonsense to me.
Yeah, it's not helpful. And so we've had very sad mass shootings in the United States, right? We've had people walk into buildings or schools or whatever. And when that happens, what do? You look at that person who did that, is that person needs to be brought to justice. They need to stop. Mm-hmm. But just because whatever race they were doesn't mean their whole group of people needs to be eradicated.
Right.
That person needs to be brought to justice. And we need to find out, did anyone know? Could we have signs that somebody's leading that direction where we could maybe stop that before it happens?
Yeah.
That's how we need to respond to these. But it's very demonic to believe that my problems are because of this other group out there, this whole group of people. So for me, that's what's so fascinating about Genesis chapter 4, when you have Cain and Abel, which really represent different lines of people, different groups of people, and his offering is not favored because he gave his second best and Abel gave his best. first fruits to the Lord, and so Cain was angry and sad and said, why is this guy favored? Why is Abel favored? And God says, why are you angry? Why is your face downcast? If you would do it as right, wouldn't I approve of you? But now sin is crouching at your door. You must rule over it, or it's going to eat you alive, basically. But he didn't. He saw Abel as his problem. If he could just get rid of his competition, if he just could get rid of that comparison, he didn't want to look inside. And I think that's another thing that we have to really pay attention to, is that all the evil that's out in the world, even in terrorist organizations, you can find the seed of that in your own heart. And unless we also look inside of our own heart and see the seed of how often we want to blame our problems on a certain group of people or somebody else outside of us, and saying all my problems are because of that person or that group or that whatever, and if I just didn't have that thing impeding me, my life would be perfect.
Yeah.
That's not looking inside and recognizing I also have things to change. So I think that's what this crisis also gives us an opportunity to do, is the reality that's, as Alexander Solzhenitsyn said, sin cuts through every human heart. And it's not just that's what that quote is just so fascinating, because Solzhenitsyn was a prisoner of the Gulag, and Stalin believed that anybody who got in his way for his communist regime, all those people need to be eradicated. And so he thought, if I could just round up the bad people who weren't on board with my communism ideal, then we could have a pure race. We could have a pure group. Well, after killing 40 million of his own people, he couldn't find that pure group. And so Alexander Solzhenitsyn had this really enlightened thought that, if only it were so easy, if we could just find those evil people out there somewhere and just get rid of them, but evil cuts through every human heart. And I think that's the problem with any of these terrorist organizations. They're saying, if we could just eradicate the Jews, then all our problems would be gone.
Yeah.
And they're not going to stop until that happens.
Yeah. So I think like on some level, I don't know the history of Hamas really well.
Yeah.
And maybe on some level we can all appreciate, if those people grow up and they're feeling oppressed and they have they're indoctrinated and they're told Israel is evil, I think we can understand them on some level, maybe. But at the same time, it's like the tricky thing. It's like the tricky thing with forgiveness, where, if someone, you can release someone from the guilt of their sins, but for the good of society, they need to be stopped.
They need to be stopped.
Yeah.
Right. That justice.
Yeah.
So I was sitting down with our oldest daughter, trying to talk through some of these things. And I just wanted her to know, because if, she goes to a university where we're seeing these pro-Hamas protests going on right now at some of these
Americans are so dumb.
bigger universities. I just want to sit down with her and say, what we talked about is like, honey, you never can look at a person just by their skin and the color of skin and put them in a category and think that group of people or that person who's a part of that group of people is somehow inferior. And I said, any ideology that labels a group of people and says this group of people needs to be stopped and everything about this group of people is bad, that it's not cultures, it's not races, it's not people groups that are a problem, it's ideologies. These ideas, these demonic ideas that there are some people who don't possess the image of God that have to be eradicated, not because they did something wrong. Yet, like you said, if somebody does something wrong and is pursuing evil, it is the just thing to stop the perpetrators.
Yeah.
You have to stop the perpetrators when they're hurting people. But to then clump all these groups of people together, I was trying to warn her against dangerous ideologies because it can be so tricky. Are there white people, black people, brown people, whatever, who've done bad things? Yes. Do you clump them all together and say now all these people need to be eradicated? No. That's I think the big difference that we're seeing right now.
Yeah. So I guess then my question is, where do we have that same problem here in the safety and protection of, Wisconsin, United States? Because we live around Milwaukee, which is like one of the most segregated cities in the country.
I really appreciate, one of the things that we did when we moved back to Milwaukee areas, we chose schools for our kids that were very diverse. And it's interesting, our kids generation, I think, don't see things like a previous generation. And for me, it's again, ideologies, not about races. All right, if you have an ideology that's dangerous, I'm going to stay away or not follow your ideology. But I would hope we could all learn to talk to people of other backgrounds. For me, the big eye-opening thing was I grew up in a very white neighborhood and did not have a lot of diverse friends. When I went to public school, I had some more friends from different backgrounds. But when I learned Spanish and I went to Ecuador and I knew enough Spanish to be able to listen to the family talking, and I heard the father and mother talking in the kitchen, and I was like, that's the same stuff my dad says to my mom. Like,
yeah.
And if I wouldn't know the language, I wouldn't have that connection.
Yeah.
But I was like, we're on the other side of the southern hemisphere. We are in a whole different culture, and he's saying the same thing my dad says to my mom, but it's just in a different language. Yeah. And so I think proximity does a lot of that. That's what all these kind of ideologies and all these groups, you dehumanize people. Mm-hmm. You don't spend time with them. And I remember talking to somebody when I lived in Florida. He was a self-diagnosed racist. He said, I grew up a white racist. I was racist of all black people. And then he talked about when he worked for the railroad, and his partner was black. And he's like, I love that guy. And I got to know him, and I realized like I had been wrong. And just people are people. There's people.
Yeah.
And so it's the ideologies. It's not the races. It's not the cultures. So we have to fight ideologies with ideas. And that's what I'm trying to do with my kids, train them to look at people as people and see people made in the image of God and be open to, their culture, their background, but then be able to distinguish when you hear an ideology that's dangerous, whether it's coming from Nazi Germany or a Hamas group or a Ku Klux Klan group. These are all different. They're white, they're black, they're brown. They're all, they can come from any different race, but it's the ideology.
Yeah. I forgot what I was going to say.
Because you were so enraptured. With my rant.
Yes.
But I don't know. I think that's the discussion that needs to be had, and that's what, in many ways, our country was founded on. Unfortunately, it was not practiced. There was racism that was part of our country from the very beginning. And that's what many people did with Native Americans. They dehumanized them. So over and over again, we see this pattern of looking at a group of people, dehumanizing them, and then it justifies violence towards the whole group. Because if you really saw yourself in them and you could see they're just like your own children, they're just like your own family, they're just like you wouldn't be able to blindly create violence.
Man,
What do you think?
I'm thinking about the school where I teach,
Yeah.
which has a good is actually not a majority of white students.
Yeah, it's
Like
a very diverse school.
45% white or something.
Yeah.
I don't know. To me, I still see. I think especially guys,
Mm-hmm.
they do tend to seems like mostly hang out with people of the same skin color.
Mm-hmm.
The kids talk about race all the time there.
Yeah.
They talk about race all the time. Sometimes they say offensive things as jokes, which I definitely stop immediately and don't laugh at.
No.
But it's interesting. One interesting thing is calling people light-skinned as opposed to like dark-skinned, like you're less African American or something like that. I don't know. That just popped into my mind. It's sort of like that push to behave in a certain way or to like act less like a white person and more like a black person. I just think that's, first of all, stupid, but it's kind of sad.
Yeah, there's just a lot of pressure all around. I mean, there's a lot of pressure, a lot of confusion. You're trying to get your identity, and I think there are experts who, I think, at that school who are doing a great job. I think about the two vice presidents at the school who just do such a good job of vice principals there that are working with those kids and are navigating these topics on race so well. But I will just keep going back to the closer you get to people,
Yeah.
the harder it is to hate them.
Yeah, the thing I was going to bring up is I think, like you said, when you stop seeing people as individuals, then it's easy to just put them in a box or whatever.
Yeah.
And if you don't ever get close enough to know any individuals, then that's even easier to do.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So I think we're going to have to call out these ideologies as the generations continue. They're not going away, and they get dressed up with different. I think they're all diabolical.
Yeah.
And they're all half truths. You know, they might bring out some truth that there's been oppression, there's been problems, but the solution to eradicate a group of people is not the solution. And it's surprising because we look back on the Holocaust with horror. Or the civil rights movement with horror, or the slavery and horror.
Not everyone does, because some people believe that the Holocaust never happened.
That's what I mean. You have to make up these other things to be able to stomach it. But I think we're reliving some of these things that we couldn't believe happened 80 years ago, and they're happening again. And I think it's a time for moral clarity and seeing how the Bible describes a human being and the value of a human being.
Yeah.
And then how to bring about mercy and justice to individuals and not to whole groups.
And I agree with you for Christians, but I don't know a lot of Christians that aren't clear on like the whole "you shall not murder" thing. You know, I think the sad thing is, like, now that we are, what do they call us, a post-Christian nation?
Yeah.
You know, where it's kind of like, man, not only do we not have like community and family values holding us together, but now we don't even have any religious values, and our whole country is just like a independent, do what you want. You have the opportunity to rise to the top, so come to our country, strike it rich. You know, that's kind of like the whole appeal of our country now.
Right.
It's just the opportunity and the raw capitalism of all of it, you know. But now there's not even any communal values where like people can just bend the truth and that's acceptable.
Yeah. Yeah, I don't think there's hope for the West because we've lost all those values. But as a pastor, I'm hoping that I can lead whatever people in our congregation and community will listen to this podcast and remind them what the Bible says about what a human is, what a race is, what a culture is, that God says in Revelation 7 and in the end of the Bible, it talks about how John saw before the throne people from every language, tribe, nation, and people standing before the throne, worshiping the Lamb. And so God created all these different people, and there's something about these cultures that will be preserved at the resurrection. Mm-hmm. And there's something beautiful we can find in all these cultures. The thing that needs to be overturned are diabolical ideologies. Mm-hmm. And so I don't have any hope to change. We don't have the scaffolding in the West of those things you're talking about, family values, mm-hmm. cultural values, biblical values. But we do have Christians in our congregation, in our culture, who are being kind of twisted by the cultural mm-hmm. values. And I hope that maybe something like this could hold back some of those ideas.
Well, and I think the other thing you said was good, which is, as Christians, we want to be quick to forgive. Mm-hmm. But at the same time, you have to stop people doing evil things.
Right.
They just have to be removed from society if they are causing harm to people.
Right. And that's how the Bible is portrayed over and over again. When Pharaoh was continuing to hold God's people captive and enslave them, and he hardened his heart and he was not going to stop, God finally had to stop him. And that mm-hmm. kind of becomes the paradigm for how we treat perpetrators. Some people will continue to harm people, and they will not stop until you forcefully stop them. Mm-hmm. And so that's why we have the government and the law. And sometimes, they do reach out for repentance and forgiveness once they are stopped. But very, very often they have given themselves into sin so much and hardened their hearts so much, you can't do anything but just physically restrain and stop them and put them somewhere where they can't hurt people anymore. And that's a statement that if you do this, this is going to happen to you too.
Right.
Again, individual justice that gets taken out, not retributional justice across whole people groups, right, because you want vengeance.
So here's a depressing thought I just had.
Oh boy.
Is that if as a country, mm-hmm. Maybe not right now, but in the very near future, maybe the majority of people are not drawing these values that we take for granted from the Bible.
Yeah.
I mean, you're already taking human beings and you're saying human beings are just more evolved animals.
Right.
And then you're saying we need to protect the animals.
Yeah.
And you're saying that, if the world is ending, that humans are really the problem because of climate change or this sort of thing. Okay, well, that's one side of that. And then you're saying that everything's subjective, and then you're saying that, abortion, obviously a big one too, but if there's no like concrete, this is what a human life is worth.
Yeah.
Where are people getting these ideas? Because my personal thought is that obviously we all know this is true. I think we all know deep down it's true, mm-hmm. and people are just taking it for granted.
And so you're saying what's going to happen when that goes away?
Well, I mean, I think it'll stick around longer than quote unquote it should, but I think people are just allowing themselves. People are starting to think this through and saying, wait a second, like if we don't have the Bible, then that's what makes way for all of this.
Yeah.
Either if it's critical race theory or if it's just like a materialistic worldview.
Right.
Yeah,
some are actually, I think we are living on the fumes of our Christian heritage.
Yeah.
And that is wearing out. And some people are being so bold as to say, if survival of the fittest is true, why don't we just let that play out? And if the value is not intrinsic based on the image of God, but it's based on productivity or capacity, then yeah, let's get rid of people with low capacities or mental capability, issues. And so, yeah, you are seeing more and more people get bolder about, hey, let's actually live out our values. But I think you're right that because of the natural knowledge of God, and God has given us a conscience that does curb some of this behavior, but it is harder to have a level plane, or it's harder to have common ground to talk on. Like, now we both see the intrinsic value of humans, right?
Yeah.
Well, maybe not.
Yeah.
All right. So, well, we both feel like there should kind of be intrinsic values, right? It's just harder to find common ground to then base laws and society on when you don't have that common heritage. I think that's why there are some people who are really concerned, when it comes to immigration or things like that. Like, all right, do we need to pay attention to, if you are a pro-Hamas person, not Palestinian or Muslim or anything like that, but you support terrorism, do we want a large group of people in the country with that? That's a question that people have. And we think, oh, of course, they're going to assimilate. Well, people aren't assimilating into those cultural values anymore. And so that
there are no joint cultural values.
Right. And so that's our Constitution, at least at one time, was that unifying document that said we do have intrinsic values given by our rights, given by our Creator. So that's way beyond our pay grade, and that's way beyond what I can talk about. But if there are a small group of people in our congregation, or whatever, I can lead as a pastor. Mm-hmm. I hope that we as a group can shine brighter in the world when we look at people and say, you are intrinsically valuable because you are made in the image of God, even if you deny who that God is.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Man, I watched the news for the first time in a long time.
Yeah.
Because I had to look at a little bit of this stuff. And man, people, the world is ending. Don't leave your homes. It's over. Country's crumbling.
I don't think
so depressed right now.
Yeah. No, I think we've had this at every generation. This is not a new thing. I've heard people say, do I think the world is ending? Well, just go back any period of history, you could find something like this. But we do have hope that God does bring people to justice, that God is still in control, that God is using this for furthering his kingdom. But Jesus promised, in this world you're going to have trouble. So I do think it is the Christian hope that leads us to keep opening up businesses, keep having families, keep having babies, keep getting out of our house, because we do have hope that God is still using it all and he is coming back again.
Yeah. It's actually really nice out, people. Go outside. It's fall. It's beautiful out there.
All right. Nice shot, Matt.
If you'd like to get a hold of us here at the Climbing Sycamores podcast, feel free to email bsadler@victoryofthelamb.com. bsadler@victoryofthelamb.com. If you like today's intro music, it's been brought to you by Andrew Lynch's song, My Name, Hello.